Welcome to the Galloway Show, exclusively on YouTube. This is No Budget Television, brought to you from my back bedroom by me and my missus. No Budget Television with a bigger audience than Piers Morgan, the flagship show of, did I say ship? Show of Rupert Murdoch's multi-billion pound empire. Schadenfreude, moi. The fact that I had a bigger audience for this show, No Budget, than Piers Morgan's multi-million pound budget, tells me lots, not just about me, but also about him, and also about the media market that we are now in. Now, if I had any kind of budget at all, even just to promote this show, never mind to make it look and sound better, imagine what I could do. It's almost enough to make you do the national lottery, if you know what I mean. But in the interim, you can support the return of the midweek edition of the mother of all talk shows by the very simple expedient of going to Super Chat right now or in the course of this show on As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, actually, that's a first for me. Is that actually a cyber attack? Who shall I blame for the cyber attack, if that is what it were? Is it the platform? Is it the Paul Mason nexus? Is it the Pentagon? Who knows? But I was going to say some fairly strong words about them. So let me do so while I have the chance before I come under further cyber attack. Prepare to die for Lithuania. Words I never thought that I would ever say and that you never thought that you would ever hear. But it is not hyperbole. The truth is, World War III may very well begin over a country, I call it a country, a principality really, called Lithuania, where a third of the population are Russian. You see, Lithuania divides Russian territory from the Russian motherland. I refer, of course, to Kaliningrad. Always a part of Russia, recognized by every government in the world as a part of Russia, and indeed, proper transport and other links between the Russian mainland and Kaliningrad is guaranteed by a treaty between Russia and the European Union. Quite a recent treaty, in fact. But Lithuania has decided, although you'd have to be an idiot to think that it came up with this one on its own, that it actually can besiege Kaliningrad, nothing in, nothing out of a part of Russia. It can seal it off completely from the world. There are two problems, at least, with that. The Russian Navy docks in Kaliningrad and has done so since before the United States existed as a country. In fact, long before the United States existed as a country. And the second problem with it is that if you think that Russia will allow a part of itself to be severed by the Principality of Lithuania, you are a fool. The truth is, the Russian response will be swift and terrible. As Adolf Hitler found out 80 years ago this day, because this is the 80th anniversary of the Hitlerite invasion of the then Soviet Union. Barbarossa, it was called. Barbarous it was indeed, killing tens of millions of people, slaughtering millions of people, civilians, in the Eastern Holocaust. If anything, even more terrible, up close, personal, and horrifically brutal than the Holocaust in the West. I'm talking pits filled with dead people, with fascists, Ukrainian fascists, in fact, walking on the backs of the corpses and filling them with lead to make sure that no one survived in those pits. I'm talking millions of people slaughtered in the Eastern Holocaust. I'm talking 26 million Soviet citizens killed in the Second World War, which for Russia began on this day 80 years ago. Whilst it's true that fascism extorted an enormous cost, human and material, from Russia, from the Soviet Union, in truth, now that you look back on it, the minute that Hitler launched his aggression against the Russian people, the end was nigh for Nazism. Fascism's days were numbered from that day, even though in the first part of the invasion, they carried everything before them, reached the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, starved millions in both cities, reached the gates, in the gates of Stalingrad itself. It was only a matter of time. And once the tide had turned, the Russian, Soviet, Red Army response was swift and very, very terrible. And when Berlin was in ruins in May of 1945 and the Soviet flag was hoisted over the ruins of the Reichstag, and Hitler lay dead like a rat in his bunker, the Germans realized, if they had not realized long before that, that invading Russia was a very serious mistake, as Napoleon had found earlier, as Winston Churchill found in 1920, only just over 100 years ago, when 100,000 British and American soldiers invaded the infant Soviet Republic and tried to regime change it, only to leave with their tails between their legs. Everybody who invades and seeks to occupy Russian territory in the end lives and dies to regret it. And so will Lithuania. I don't know what the Russian response will be, but I did read this evening that the Kremlin has decided on its response, and it will not publish its response. It will merely carry out its response. Now, that could be something very terrible indeed. That could be the invasion and the obliteration of the Principality of Lithuania. That could be its absorption into the Russian Federation. It could be military, it could be technical, it could be economic, it could be many things. But whatever it is, it will not be good for Lithuania. And in fact, the Lithuanian state, like the Hitlerite state, will undoubtedly come to regret this aggression which they have now launched, they say, in the name of the European Union against Russia in Kaliningrad. Now, it may very well be that even as I speak, the Russian response is underway. It may actually be visited on Kiev in the first instance, rather than on Lithuania. Certainly, the firepower now exists in the battle carrier group on the Black Sea to make a terrible response to Kiev. The European Union leaders, Macron and little soldier Schulz, have been silent so far on this cunning Lithuanian plan to bring the world into World War III, but not so the doltard Liz Truss, the dumb broad who acts as the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, the pound shop Thatcher, the sub-literate, ill-educated, unqualified Foreign Secretary of Great Britain has issued her full support for Lithuania's siege on Kaliningrad. No good will come of it. The British have placed themselves in the first rank of the firing line of any hot war between Russia and NATO. It would not surprise me if the British, through the foolhardiness of their rulers, are the very first target of any Russian aggression in response to the NATO threats and build-up around their state. It will not surprise me at all if this broadcast is one day suddenly cut off because Britain no longer exists as a society, as a state, because it has been turned into ash as a result of the belligerent, warlike, and utterly foolish actions of its own government, preeminent amongst them its Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. It may be that Lithuania will be forced by wiser counsel to back down, but that wiser counsel will not be either in Berlin or in Paris, because neither Berlin or Paris are calling the shots in this war. This is a United States war. And if the United States does not want all-out war with the Russian Federation, it better tell the Lithuanians to stand down right away whilst there is still time. Who'd have thought that we'd have to explain, perhaps in the next hours, to our children and our grandchildren that human life on this planet may be about to come to an end over Lithuania. Lithuania. For Wales, for Lithuania, you brought humanity to an end on this planet. You fools, you utter fools. The war, of course, is going so badly for NATO that this may be their last throw of the dice. They're losing on every front in every part of the battlefield, including the economic battlefield. Petrol has now reached unaffordable levels, and there are riots in petrol stations in the United States of America, in Sri Lanka, in Eastern Europe, and soon coming to a petrol station near you. We're a long way, 12 weeks or so, from when we have to switch our heating back on again, at which point we may find that there is no heating, at least that we can afford. Our food prices are multiplying. The British rate of inflation this day reached a 40-year high. 40-year. 1982. You remember it? Those of you in Britain, you remember 1982. You remember UB40. You remember the dark and dismal winter of 1982. You remember the cities in England and Wales on fire in the riots. You remember the mass unemployment, the dole queues that stretched as far as the eye could see. You remember the mounting poverty. You remember the industrial chaos of 1982. You remember it? It took the Falklands War to pull Thatcher out of the deep political crisis in which she was in 1982. It took war to rescue the Conservative government of that time. But this is a different kind of war. The Russians are not the RGs. They're not equipped with the misfiring French dumb missiles. The Russians are a hypersonically weaponized, intercontinental ballistic powerful, with thousands upon thousands of nuclear warheads. They're not the RGs, and Putin sure ain't General Galtieri. 40 years since our inflation was 9.1% and rising. It'll rise in this year alone beyond 12%, perhaps more, perhaps much more. Of course, unless the balloon goes up and we're no longer counting prices and rates of inflation. That means, of course, that unless you get a 9.1% pay settlement in your wage negotiations this year, you've agreed to a pay cut. Unless you get 9.1% from your employer, you're going to be poorer this year even than you were last year, even than you were the year before. Now, some workers are not able to do anything about that because they're not in trade unions, or they're in trade unions without the guts and skill and guile to stand up for their members, or because they work in balkanized, atomized places of work that don't lend themselves easily to industrial action, to collective action, to free collective bargaining. And as the new hero of Britain's hour, Mick Lynch, the leader of the Railway Workers Union, RMT, put it today, if you're not bargaining, you're begging. And the working class should never have to beg. Many have no choice but to beg from the tender mercies of the Amazons and the Facebooks and the conglomerates owned by multi-billionaires, soon trillionaires. But some workers had the sagacity to join a real trade union and elect a real trade union leader. Those workers include Britain's Railway Workers Union. Britain is now in the grip of a mass national strike action by the railway workers, and it has put the British ruling class and its lick-spittle toadies in the mass media and in Parliament into meltdown. Not just because the railway workers are powerful, and again, as the leaders of the RMT have pointed out, if it's really the case that simply by not turning up for work, we are costing the economy billions, hundreds of billions of pounds, you're clearly undervaluing our contribution to the national economy. If it's really the case that you depend on us so much, then you really ought to be paying us at least an inflation level of wage settlement so that we're not poorer this year than we were last year. All unassailable economic arguments. But they have tried to assail them. They started out by lying about what the wages are in the railway industry. They tried to fool the public into believing that every member of the RMT is earning £57,000 a year. I wish that they were, but they are not. Some train drivers on some shifts with some levels of overtime can earn £57,000. And why not? After all, driving a full trainload of passengers who are all paying through the nose to private rail companies for the privilege of traveling on that train. That's a pretty responsible job. Far more responsible than reading an auto cue on Sky News and seeking to bait working people whose contribution we actually miss when they withdraw their labour. Burley Not like you, who, when you were banned for breaking the COVID protocols, nobody even knew you weren't there. Nobody gave a toss that you weren't there. And it was funny at first, watching these fulminating fat cats, every single one of them on double, treble, or in some cases, in one case that I know of for sure, Tory boy Pierce of the Daily Mail and Good Morning Britain earns 10 times the average wage earned in the railway industry. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe I'm just over empathetic, but I wouldn't have the brass neck to denounce somebody earning 10 times less than me for their greed. But no such empathy precludes the pontification of the likes of Pierce, of the likes of Kay Burley, and of the likes of the aforementioned multi-millionaire Piers Morgan. A puffed up, pumped up balloon, a popinjay whose balloon has been pricked now that he actually has a measurable audience to account for in Rupert Murdoch's multi-billion talk TV experiment. He had the Railwaymen's leader on his show, I think today. He spent 5 minutes talking to him about Thunderbirds as an attempt to bait the unbaitable. Because Mick Lynch, as Hugh Laurie, the fine English actor, famous now across the United States also, the doctor from House, pointed out on Twitter this morning. I don't know enough about the rail dispute, said Hugh, which is a bit funny because when I knew Hugh, well, he was a bit of a Trotskyite, really, so you would have thought that he would have known something about the rail dispute, but hey, he says he doesn't know enough about the rail dispute, before going on quite correctly to point out that the railway workers' leader, Mick Lynch, has wiped the floor with each and every picador set up by the mass media to spear him, to taunt him, to try and draw blood from him. You were right, Dr. Hugh. Mick Lynch wiped the floor with them. Why? Because he's standing in a just cause. And in the tradition of rail workers' union leaders, God rest Bob Crow, he doesn't care if the television pundits don't like him. He doesn't care if Tory boy Pierce doesn't like him. He's not answerable to the overpaid, pampered pompadours of Britain's mass media. He answers to the railway workers that pay his wages. He answers to the members who elect him. And in the immortal words of the late and great Bob Crow, on the subject of money, whether the Queen should be on the money or the euro should be on the money, he said, I don't care if the Queen's face or the Queen's arse is on the money. All I care about is how much of that money is in the pay packets of my members. And when that's your mentality as a union leader, and when your members are 100% behind you and ready, having balloted and overwhelmingly decided to strike, to make one fist and stand as one behind the legitimate demand for an inflation level of pay, they're not asking for the earth. They're not even asking for the bakery. They're only asking to be at least no poorer this year than they were last year. That's all. And the members have decided. And guess what? In the opinion polls, Half the country supports the rail strikes. Half the country, despite this ferocious propaganda assault under which the workers and their union are currently being bombarded. Under the silence and certainly utter inaction of the misnamed Trade Union Congress, of all the other unions that should know, as the miners once knew, if the railway workers are defeated, you stand no chance at all. But if the railway workers are victorious, then your members will be far easier to win. A struggle that will lead to a breakthrough on the wages front. But the union leaders, silent, inactive, paying lip service to the solidarity they owe to the historic railway, maritime and transport union. Their silence is deafening. And let me turn to the political class. As I say, it started out funny with the fat cats, but it grew dark when the politicians began to get involved. First of all, who else but the Labour Party and its leader, Keir Starmer, first banned any Labour MP from turning up on the picket line to show their support for the RMT, then threatened his frontbenchers with the sack if they turned up on the picket lines in solidarity with the RMT, then briefed where else? The Guardian. Late last night, it emerged. The spectre of anti-Semitism. We're not saying that Mick Lynch himself is an anti-Semite. A Labour source in Starmer's office told The Guardian. But we are saying that he has to explain why his Jewish members now regard the union as an unsafe place. I didn't see that coming. And I'm long in the tooth. And I've lived through these last few years. But even I didn't see that coming. I knew Labour was low, but I didn't think even they were that low. I didn't think they would climb into that pit of smearing 100,000 blue-collar workers who were one of the founders of the Labour Party with the foul, scandalous, baseless smear of anti-Semitism. And then the Tories got involved this morning. A well-named Tory called Toby Ellwood or something. He accused the railway workers of being Putin's friends. He begged them not to cause rejoicing in the Kremlin, as if Putin was Lenin, or as if this was 1926 and the general strike was posing an existential threat to the capitalist system itself, instead of just a group of men and women who want an inflation level of pay rise in an ordinary industrial dispute in Britain. It's taking us back to the 1970s, say the Tories and their choir, echoed, at least in the silence, from the Labour front bench. The 1970s. Those of you who've got my audiobook, Street Fighting, about the 1970s, already know that the 1970s was a joy to be alive. But this on the day that Britain went back to the 1870s when polio was found in the sewers in London. Imagine. Polio, a scourge which has been stamped out everywhere in the world, is back. Not in Burundi or in Burkina Faso, but in London, in the sewers of London. The 1970s, the Tories are taking us back to the 1870s with a Labour opposition as invisible and non-existent as the Labour opposition was in the 1870s, for it had not yet been founded by, amongst others, the Railway Workers' Union. Now, because of the interruption, I have absolutely no idea for how long I've been speaking, but I've made the main points that I wanted to make. So let me give you your chance. Any questions, Gayatri? Tanya Keane says, Schultz says they're on target for reducing CO2 emissions, and they will continue to target good countries not abiding by the rule. Today, no mention of German coal. Well, the Germans are reopening their coal-fired power stations. We cannot in Britain, for we have destroyed them. But where are they going to get the coal? Not from Poland, because the price of coal in Poland has tripled from $200 a ton to $650 a ton. Not from Britain, because we flooded. I'm not joking. We actually flooded our coal mines, not in the name of greenery, in the name of destroying the last great trade union in this land, of which I have the honor to be an honorary member for the last exactly 40 years, the National Union of Mine Workers. Would that we could reopen our coal mines. Would that the Germans could fill their energy gap with coal. Would that Polish coal was now not 3 times the price it was last year. Would that the oil companies, the 25 biggest oil companies, which last year made $250 billion in profits. $250 billion last year in profit. The oil price on the international market is less today than it was in 2009, and yet your petrol, your diesel, and mine have become untenable, unaffordable, unusable, with all of the consequences for work and industry that entails. David Fox gives Australian dollars $13.99. Thank you very much, David. Keep up the great work. Solidarity from Oz. David, I'm very much hoping that behind the scenes, the Australian government is negotiating with the United States government to drop the case against Julian Assange and allow him to come home to his homeland in Australia with his family. I pray for that every night. And some people think that it might just happen. Pray for it yourself. Michael Curry says, Putin is making sense. Lavrov is all out, realizing the West is in outer space. Well, the West is definitely in outer space. It's outer room. It has expended, as I say, 75 billion so far on the war in Ukraine, a war which is being comprehensively lost. It has cost itself its entire economic well-being. Germany, France, Britain, the United States, headed rapidly for ruin. A stone lifted at great effort, with great fanfare, dropped on our own feet. Any more R. White says Biden's latest anti-inflation policy. People who eat 3 meals a day will reduce them to 2. Those who eat 2 meals a day down to 1. Those who don't eat anything continue the course. Well, Joe Biden, who falls over on a stationary bike and wrecks the bike, never mind the state of his underwear after it happened, is not somebody I'd take economic, still less military advice from. You have to believe that Joe Biden's not really running things in the United States, in which case, which lunatics have taken over the asylum? Any more? Paul Jackson, coming soon, ration books. Well, I'm in favor of ration books. Why should I be able to buy all the petrol or the diesel if I've got the money to, leaving you, who doesn't have the money to, with no petrol or diesel at all? I'm in favor of rationing. In fact, the Germans are in the process of printing their ration books. And they're going to need them not just for fuel. They're going to need them for potatoes. They're going to need them for bread. That's the scale of the madness of the fools who've taken us over this cliff. It wasn't the workers who did this. It wasn't the workers that wrecked the economy. It wasn't the railway workers or the shop workers or the health workers that ruined our economy. It wasn't them that declared war on Russia. It was the people that own and run our economy that did it. Why should the workers pay for it when those that own and run our economy are getting richer and richer and richer as the workers get poorer and poorer and poorer? It's really not rocket science. You know, call me an optimist, but I believe the day will come, and maybe sooner than you think, when all the unions will be like the RMT, when all the union leaders will be like Mick Lynch, when all the workers will be like Britain's railway workers, and when they'll all get off their knees at the same time and stand up, and no power on earth on that day will be able to stop them. Black Jock says the pigeons are coming home to roost. This is what happens when people hand government over to a rotating crew of entitled, venal, and incompetent politicians blinded by neoliberal capitalism. Jock, I wish I'd said that. I will. I promise you. Very well said, my friend. Mac Barra says the government is lying to the people. They have known that massive inflation is coming, but they're not warning people about it. It's going to be very messy. Trust me. Well, I tend to think that you are right. I don't like messy, by the way. I want social peace in the country. I believe in order. I don't want to wreck the joint. I want a disciplined, collective, and powerful transfer of wealth and power from the wealthiest people to the workers who created that wealth and should share that power amongst themselves. I don't want it to get messy, Mac, just for the avoidance of doubt. I believe in a democratic, peaceful transfer of wealth and power from the oligarchy that currently possesses almost all of both to those that possess none of it at all. Call me old-fashioned. Foxing Band says they never look at middle-class management and diversity officers' salaries and say it's a waste of money. Very good. They don't. Neither do they look at the wages earned by the pontificators on the television, 43% of whom are privately school educated. Only 7% of the people of Britain are privately school educated, but 43% of the people you see on your screen on television are privately school educated, and 47% of the people who've got a newspaper column, nearly half, are privately school educated, while only 7 out of 100 in Britain went to these private schools. Doesn't that tell you something? They never ask the chief executives, the people rolling around in bonuses, even in the railway companies that made £500 million profit last year. Why isn't that profit shared with the workers who made it? It wasn't made by the shareholders. It wasn't made by the directors. It was made by the men and women that drive and staff the trains, the stations, maintain the track, make sure we get from A to B safely, the guards, the stewards, the drivers, the local men and women. It was them that made the £500 million profit. Not somebody who spends his time in Monaco on his yacht, but he makes off with the 500 million and expects the workers to accept a 2% wage increase when inflation is 9.1%. Do the math, as the Americans say. Susie gives $20. Thank you, Susie. Gratitude for you, George, from Arizona. Yeah, so-called USA, 80 miles from the Grand Canyon. Now you're talking. Grand Canyon, what a place. The Southwest is burning. That we have wildland firefighters making $17 an hour who can't find housing. Criminal. It's criminal, Susie, in a country whose politicians wouldn't plunge into a darkened cocktail lounge for $17 an hour, but they expect firefighters to plunge into burning wildland for $17 an hour. I always say, because I'm very close over many decades to Britain's firefighters and their union, not so much now, but I was for a very long time, before today's union leaders were born. I used to say, imagine if firefighters behaved like capitalists. Imagine if they turned up at your house on fire and negotiated, bargained with you about what price you would pay them to plunge into your burning building and rescue, God forbid, your imperiled children in the bedrooms upstairs. Imagine if halfway up the stairs, they said, no, actually, it's too hot in here. You're going to have to increase the price that you pay. Imagine if firefighters behaved like that. And yet, if they did, they'd only be behaving according to the dog-eat-dog law of the jungle mentality of capitalism, wouldn't they? That's what the capitalists would do. Any more? Gavin Gilbert says, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are starting to surrender or lay down their arms and go home. They know they're going to lose, but you won't hear this from the Western mainstream media. No, that's right. You won't, although they're well aware of it and they talk about it amongst themselves in the newsrooms. This I know. And that means they are comprehensively lying to their readers and to their audience when they pretend that the war is going otherwise. Pokemon Gifts says, what do you think of General Sanders, who says, be prepared to fight the Russians in Europe in World War III? Well, I spoke about it at some length on the Mother of All Talk Shows last Sunday in my monologue. Please refer to that. You'll find it here on YouTube. And by the way, I hope you've subscribed to my YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it will get me to 200,000 subscribers. And that will be very helpful to me vis-a-vis YouTube. So please consult last Sunday's monologue on General Sanders and World War III. Let me see. Cy Butterworth says, what about the hypocrisy of the other half all lamenting the sacrifices of those keeping the country going during the pandemic and now condemning those who simply want a cost of living rise? You couldn't make it up, Cy. Clap for the public sector workers, but pay them just a cost of living rise? Oh, no. Of course, there's a lot of idiots out there, sheep, false consciousness, we call it. People who earn not more than railway workers, but less than railway workers, who lend their voice to vile attacks on the railway workers, as if the railway workers getting less is going to mean them getting more, when of course the precise opposite is the truth. If the railway workers win, everybody wins, because everybody will be in a stronger bargaining position. But there are many idiots, millions of them, who cannot see that and who identify their interests with the billionaires. By the way, this includes long-suffering commuters on the railway who have lived under this government now for 12 years, whilst it has cut services, multiplied fares, reduced staffing, taken away ticket offices, taken away station staff, taken away guards off the trains. People who are never done complaining about how badly the commuter on the railway has been treated by this government are now backing this government against the people that work on the railway. Of course, such fools, we hope, will one day see the light. But until they do, forgive me. There's fools and there's knaves. The knaves are worse, but the fools I can't suffer gladly. Sorry. Joseph Case says, damp, mold, condensation, etc. is going to destroy houses if people can't heat them properly. Quite so. Absolutely so. There's no telling, no end to the consequences of this economic crisis into which we are accelerating, as if into a long, dark tunnel. Never mind, the winter's a long way off. 12 weeks or so. Mochi Belina says, like Reagan broke the air traffic controllers, cut wages across America to combat inflation. Here it comes again, as he put it. There you go again. Mark Riding says, as an ex-Brit ambulance staff, sold out by the union leadership in 1989, keep your eye on your leadership, rail workers. They can truly function as the controlled police force of the working class. Well, I don't know about you, Mark, but I think that Mick Lynch is the greatest thing since sliced bread, or since Bob Crow anyway. Michael Kelleher says, in past conflicts and wars, leaders wanted to resolve them by peace talks. Why isn't anyone looking to deconflict this war in the Ukraine? Well, you got it in one. The leaders, by which I mean the United States, don't actually want this war to end. Not while they're losing it so heavily. because the price that Russia will exact for bringing this war to an end is 100,000 times higher than it was before the war began. Then all it needed was a pen. Now it'll take a lot more than that. Vlado Paranzon says 100 miles train trip in the UK on Virgin cost me £92. The trip from Venice to Trieste, about 200 kilometers, cost me €17.50. Go figure. Well, you're quite right. We're paying more than ever for less than ever, and they want to pay the workers less than they paid them last year. You're having a laugh. Anyone who puts up with that without a fight is one of the aforementioned fools. Tanya Keane says it's dark in winter from 3 p.m. to 9 a.m. Can't use a blanket to see. Very well put, Tanya. Very well put indeed. I think I'm getting to the end of my voice. Angela O'Mara says Russia will win any war NATO wants to bring on. If NATO were going to enter the fight, they would have done so. They attacked Iraq with a false flag. They don't have the bottle to take on Russia. You may be right, Angela, or I may be right, that Lithuania, unless someone stops it right now, is going to be the beginning of a general European war, which may very well turn into a nuclear war. Thank you for watching. I'm retiring to Patreon. If you want to do some more Q&A with me there, join me. Patreon.com/George Galloway. Join me on Sunday for the mother of all talk shows.